Hey, this is Brock from Eagle Crest Studios. Today we are back after a few month hiatus and we are making an espresso bean Starbucks end table. I've always wanted to do something like this. I've made some epoxy tables before. I've seen some of these online, but none of them really were up to the standard that I had. They all covered them with epoxy. So what I'm hoping to do in this video is actually give a texture to the table, which I think is gonna be really cool. So without further ado, let's dive into this video. So the first couple bits of this project are all mainly just to cleaning up the piece of wood that I have. So I have a roughly 28-inch piece of black walnut. It's a live edge about 8 to 9 inches wide depending on where you measure it at. And as always, we gotta knock off the bark. So I just used my chisel, knocked off the bark, and then I was just sanding it up to get all the loose pieces off. Now you may remember this piece before, and this is actually the casting that I used for my other video when I was making the other epoxy table that had the burnt fire edge into it. All I'm doing now, I just had to touch up a few spots. This is that Tyvek tape, and this is good because it doesn't really allow the epoxy to stick to it. So later when we go to knock it off, you're gonna see it's a lot easier to get undone. So now that I have everything marked off, what I'm doing is just caulking it down. I just use the regular bathroom caulk, just the quick dry one, because I do not have any patience. So now that we get the whole frame set up, what I'm doing now is actually caulking the inside. And the reason why this is important is because epoxy, while it dries and it's sticky, it is basically as fluid as water. And I know that might sound silly, but you've ever had something thick like maple syrup and it runs slow and you can kind of catch it. Well, epoxy really is not like that. It's basically as thin as water. So if it gets one leak, it's going to run. Now, what I'm also doing here, and I'm sure you've seen this in other videos, is that I'm building a dam underneath the epoxy table. So this is the table part, which is the piece of wood, but I'm putting caulking underneath. And the reason for this is because I don't want the epoxy to run underneath. One, because it will just make a mess and be harder to clean. But two, it's also going to fill up that area and it would push up my wood and make it float. So it would be off-centered and my epoxy would be a lot thicker and my wood would just be floating and kind of half in, half out, and it really would not look good at all. So once I get that all centered up, I'm just giving a slight little push, gonna let it dry for about 24 to 48 hours, and then come back and get ready for the first part of the project. So you'll notice here that I'm actually using tabletop epoxy, and typically this is done on the top of the project, aka tabletop epoxy. But what I like about it is that it dries fairly quickly and it dries actually very clear. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a 1-to-1 ratio of it in order to seal in the wood and my Tyvek tape before I put my epoxy down. So the reason why I'm doing this is because I'll be adding a slight coloring and a slight stain to the epoxy. It's going to be a green color. And if you remember on my other project, which was the chessboard where I used the green, I didn't seal in my wood and I actually had a slight green stain to a lot of my wood pieces. And it wasn't the end of the world, but it just didn't look great. So what I'm doing now is just sealing in that open end of the wood. I'm also going to seal the top end, and then also I'm going to be sealing all the Tyvek tape. And another reason why this will be good is because if I see there are any leaks, I'll be able to catch it now when I only mix up a little bit of epoxy compared to when I do my bigger pour, which is very expensive and can also make a mess if you let it spill. I'm currently working in my basement right now. Now, one thing I want to mention is that the thing about this is not necessarily a 100% required step, but I think if you're going to spend the time to buy live edge wood, buy the epoxy, buy the stain, buy all the Tyvek tape, which surprisingly is not very cheap at all, I would recommend doing this. It's going to delay your project by at least probably 24 hours, but it's definitely worth it in the end. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that you see that white color? It's really not going to stay like that. It's just the thicker side of the epoxy. So don't worry if you get a few streaks like that. It will all buff out later. Now we're ready to put the espresso beans into the mold. So you'll see they're actually sticking to the bottom of the Tyvek tape, and that's because I actually use that epoxy, and it has a little bit of tackiness to it, which makes it really nice. Now what I want to do here is just pour everything out. There's really no science to this because it's just pouring beans into a casting, which is pretty straightforward. But as you can see, once you spread it out, you can brush it over with your hand, make sure everything's evenly dispersed because you want to make sure it's as level and as flat as possible. I've also heard of people tamping this with a little mallet, which is always possible as well. I didn't do it for this. I didn't really think it was necessary. But if you have a bigger project, I'm sure that's something that would be worth doing. Now for our next step, we have to get ready for the deep pour epoxy, and this is done by the Phantom version by Total Boat. And what I actually did was I kept the containers sealed, but I soaked both of the containers in a little bit of warm water. This helped to get it loose when it was in my cool basement for a couple weeks, and also made it much easier to pour and mixed a lot better. Now because it's Folgers, I had to do this since it's a coffee brand, so we're doing Starbucks and Folgers together with a little bit of Bonsai Green, which is the little green tint I'm putting into the epoxy. And the reason for this is that if you have clear epoxy, it can tend to yellow after a couple years. And because Starbucks and Folgers are both green in their branding, I had to do a little bit of green. So this is perfect. We got coffee, we got green epoxy, we got a black walnut piece of wood, we're all set. Now you can see here, I'm pouring it throughout all of the beans. The thing is this is naturally gonna spread everywhere. But I like to make sure I soak all the beans, especially the top layer, because that's going to be what seals everything in. And if you don't, you may have coffee beans chipping off, which really isn't the end of the world. You just wouldn't want your dog or a cat or something to potentially eat one of these things because it can make them sick from the epoxy and also the coffee as well. Now what I'm doing next is just tamping it down a little bit, and you're gonna see that not all of the beans are gonna be perfectly level at first. They're gonna rise, they're gonna sink. So just doing a quick little tap allows you to make sure you cover all aspects of the beans and make sure they're pretty level with your piece of wood. Now, it's not the end of the world if you get it a little bit out of order because we're gonna be sanding this down so we can make adjustments to the beans and or the wood if it's not completely level. Now that we have everything covered up, we are going to wait about 3 or 4 days to let the epoxy dry. Once we get that, we'll be able to test it and push down on the beans, and you're going to see here, no issues there. It's all dry. We're ready to move on to the next step. So remember before we actually put a clear layer on the wood? Well, we're gonna have little pieces that fall in there, which is natural, and we kind of knew this was gonna happen. So all we have to do is take 150 grit sandpaper and give it a rough little sanding. You don't have to worry about all the marks this is making because when you put over the new epoxy, all of this is going to go away. If you have pieces you can't get out with sandpaper, I was coming in and using my chisel, just using it by hand. And this is technically a wood chisel used to act for carving, but it made a good use for something like this when you just have to pry out little pieces of coffee beans that were submerged in the epoxy. Now you want to make sure you're careful with how you're doing this because you can see I took off a little bit of wood there, which really isn't the end of the world. You're not going to be able to tell, but just make sure you're cautious with how you're doing this. Now we have another layer of just the tabletop epoxy. So the reason why we're doing just tabletop here is because we already cleaned up that piece of wood and we're trying to level it with the coffee beans. You'll notice that when the coffee beans were settling, they actually rose a little bit. So in order to make sure the surfaces are level, I'm putting an extra layer of epoxy on just the wood here. So I'm not going on the beans really at all. It's just for this piece of wood. Now, anytime you pour epoxy, you're bound to get bubbles. And I know some people will recommend using a torch. Some people recommend a heat gun. Personally, I have a torch, but I guess it's probably more dangerous, so don't try this at home since it's open flame. But it works great for popping the bubbles. As you'll see here, I'm just going over lightly and quickly over the wood, and you'll see all those bubbles are popping right away. You want to make sure you only do this a few times though, because there were prior projects where I kept trying to pop the bubbles, and it got to a point where I actually burned my epoxy because I had such a big heat source on it for so long. So only use this sparingly. Now, as you can see, we have a great clean pour. We'll let this dry again, and then we're going to touch up and break it out of the mold roughly 24 hours later. So before I pop it out, I want to give it a rough sanding, and you'll notice that there's a lot of sanding and a lot of pouring over this project, and this is the reason for that is you want to make sure it's perfect. So before you do anything, I'd always recommend making sure you have enough materials and making sure you're planning for all this, because it's not as easy as it looks, and it always takes longer than you think. So give yourself plenty of time and plenty of resources for this project. Now, when you're working on your project, you can see exactly what it's going to look like in the end. And you'll notice there's those lines in the wood. That's not going to be an issue because we're going to be covering all of this with a layer of epoxy, and that's just a surface dent. But what I'm doing is just going over and sanding out any of the major divots I can feel, because those are going to be the ones that show up if you have major issues with your drying process. Now, remember before I talked about the Tyvek tape and putting down the layer of epoxy before gluing it on? Well, this is why. So this is actually surprisingly one of the easiest pours I've done and the easiest one to get off. Once again, I'm using my chisel just to go over the process and go actually underneath and between the Tyvek tape and my epoxy project and just prying up. And you want to go slowly around the entire project because you wouldn't want to split or crack your project when trying to pry it up. So now that we have the piece removed from the wood, what I need to do is just clean up the base of it. What I'm doing now is just taking my chisel and cleaning up all the extra caulking that's on the bottom. Most of this will come off just by hand, but occasionally you might either have to sand it or even plane it. Not really a big deal, just something you have to factor in. Also here, you can see this is excess epoxy that ran over the side of the piece, which really isn't a big deal. It's actually what's supposed to happen. You can either wipe it up while it's still wet, or I let it dry here and then just chisel it off. Either way, it's gonna work. Now, one of the last parts of doing this is you can see I still have a lot of caulking on the side, and sometimes it's easier just to trim up your piece by 1/2 of an inch. And I did this for both sides and it actually worked really well. The thing I would say is when you're building a project, you want to build it slightly oversized because then you can always cut it to size, but you can never add it back. Now we're finally in the home stretch. For this last part, I'm putting on a final layer of the tabletop epoxy. Once again, you want to make sure you mix this up really well because this is going to be the final layer we have on there. And then I'm just using a piece of wood that I'm using to spread out the epoxy. So it's naturally self-leveling, but sometimes it does help to move it around to make sure you cover all areas. In this, you'll notice I'm only pouring it on the wood. I've already sealed up the bean side of the table and a little bit leaked over there, which really isn't a big deal. I can just wipe it up, but I really don't need to add any more over there. I only need to level it on the wood side. Now, you saw there, I'm actually putting on a little bit of olive oil, and I know this might sound crazy, but I found that olive oil is one of the best finishes for epoxy tables, and people may disagree, and a lot of people are going to probably say that's crazy. But the thing is there's a lot of good finishes out there, but if you have a pet or a kid or whatever it is, some of those finishes can be really, really toxic, and there's no sense in getting someone sick over a finished table. So I used the actual oil, and it works great. So there you can see a couple of different close-ups, and we're pretty much all set. Now all we have to do is add some legs, and there's our project. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoy.